Okay. So again, welcome to everyone. And this is actually our first set seminar for this spring semester. We usually have three seminars per semester. We have been running this seminar for 1.5 years already. And SET stands for Social Ecological Transition Seminar. It is a joint initiative between 3 different research centers in 3 different European universities. The research group on collective action, change and transition at the University of Trento, the Center for Sustainability and Socially Responsible Consumption at the Bournemouth University, and the Environmental Sociology section at the University of Örebro. And we aim with this seminar to reflect with critical instrument and theory on socio-ecological transformation in this particular time that is crossed by several crises. The main focus we have in this seminar is on everyday life and the sphere of social and ecological reproduction. The intention is to have a kind of forum open to diverse audience, including academics, students, practitioners, social movement, and non-specialist public. And we are recording also these seminars because we would like to create. There are already many of these initiatives, but another form also of instrument also to open up and debates with our students. We are planning actually to use this seminar also in our teaching next year. And this evening, we are actually very happy to have Marlyne Sahakian here with us. Marlyne is really a very active and prominent scholar in the area of sociology of consumption, and she fits perfectly this, and we were really looking forward to have this chat with her tonight. Marlyne has a PhD in development studies, and she's at present associate professor in sociology at the University of Geneva. And she specializes on consumption, on the theme of consumption from a sustainability perspective. She is a founding member of SCORI Europe, a network for research and action on sustainable consumption, and is also the co-chair since 2019 of the European Sociological Association Consumer Research Network. She's also co-editor of the new journal Consumption Society, which is published by Bristol University Press, and there is a 3rd issue coming out soon. Her research interest is in understanding everyday practices in relation to environmental promotion, social equity, and social change. And she is also coordinating a number of research projects which look at household energy, food consumption, and well-being. She's the author of many interesting journal articles. And we are here tonight, this evening, to present one of her books. She wrote together with some other colleagues. This book was a precious reading for our research group and our reading group, as we like to call this seminar. The title is Consumption Corridors, Living a Good Life Within Sustainable Living Limits. And she has titled her presentation of today out of this book, How to Enhance People's Chances to Live a Good Life Within a Limit. So again, many thanks, Marlyne, to be with us this evening, and I leave it to you for your presentation. And we will have about 25, 30, 35, as much as you like. Then we will open up the discussion, and we usually aim to stay within 1 hour and 30 maximum for this session. So thank you, Marlyne. I should probably give you the possibility to share.
Yes.
Yes, here it is.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation, for this very warm and nice introduction. And as Francesca was saying, we are several authors that really work together. I think it took us about 2 years to write this book in a collaborative fashion, and then it takes 2 hours to read. But in fact, any one of the authors would have maybe presented consumption corridors a little bit differently. So this is my way of presenting the consumption corridors framework, and no doubt, yeah, other readings of the book are possible. The presentation that I've made around consumption corridors is intended also to sort of capture the attention of policymakers, environmental organizations. So I might go through the first slides rather quickly because it sets the stage of why maxima and minima limits to consumption might be necessary. So some of you might have, may already be convinced that we need consumption corridors, but that's what I will try and argue in the first part. Then I will introduce the concept and then end with some ideas on how it might be or has been and can be operationalized. So you may have seen this image going around social media that as we are being told to wash our hands around the COVID pandemic, there are other waves of crises that are coming our way, which has led to this idea that human activities are a geological force in and of themselves, what some call the anthropocene. I like Donna Haraway's word, the Stulucene, as it is supposed to be very difficult to say and even challenge what it means to be human as we say the word. But essentially, these graphs speak for themselves. We are in an unprecedented time in relation to global warming. We also are on a planet that is very much occupied by humans and the animals that we either eat or, mostly eat, I would say. So these dynamics are contributing to a dual crisis, not only climate change, but also biodiversity loss and the extinction of species. So a new paradigm has emerged already to capture environmental issues. I'm sure most of you are familiar with, or all of you are familiar with, planetary boundaries. And the idea that transgressing one or more of these boundaries could lead to catastrophic change. And we can criticize such an approach. We've written with other scholars a counter proposal for societal boundaries. We can ask, who gets to decide what the high impact categories are? How exactly do those boundaries become established? And where are the human activities in all of this? But nonetheless, this framework of thinking of upper limits does exist and has to some extent captured our imagination when it comes to thinking about what might be a safe operating space for humanity. There are other tools and visual aids that are out there, including the STGs. And I present this when I go and speak to organizations that are very committed to the SDGs to make the point that they are insufficient because they do not interrelate. They are presented in a rather linear fashion. And I'm sure some of you are also familiar with some of these critiques. So moving even a step further is Kate Raworth's vision of donut economics, where she's essentially taken the outer planetary boundaries, but also integrated some SDGs in what she calls a social foundation. And here we get to an even different idea of what a sustainable society might look like. And it's this idea of living in a safe and just space. But we want to argue with consumption corridors that somehow upper and lower limits are necessary even when you consider these different social foundations. So the good news is the model exists for Kate Raworth's donut. It is being implemented. I know of universities that are using the donut model, cities that are trying to experiment with the donut model, and colleagues at the University of Leeds have used the model to look on a national basis how different countries are doing. And the bad news is no country is currently living in the donut. So no country as as of yet, knows how to meet a social foundation without bypassing these planetary boundaries. And this has led Julia Steinberger and her colleagues to talk about a triple dilemma or trilemma. I don't know if you've seen this chart before, but I find it very illustrative of the challenge that we're in. Essentially, they've taken life expectancy to be an indicator of well-being. They look at carbon emissions to indicate environmental impact. And then you have income per capita illustrated in these different colored balls. And essentially, we do not know today how to be rich, live long, and have a low per capita CO2 footprint. So this is really the central question that we're asking ourselves as scholars working in sustainable consumption is, how can you live a good life while reducing your environmental impact, and maybe also finding new ways to think about what is prosperity that go beyond income per capita as the main aim. The other good news is this question of how to affect consumption is starting to emerge in different arenas. I remember maybe, I don't know, some 15 years ago, there was so much focus and emphasis on systems of production. Ecological economics led to industrial ecology approaches, and there was much less going on in terms of sustainable consumption. Thus, a need, let's say, to launch and found the SCORI network focused on sustainable consumption research and action. But now we are seeing so-called demand coming up in IPCC reports, and I haven't read the synthesis that has just been published yet. It's on my to-do list for this weekend, but apparently consumptions and lifestyles really do have a prominent place in these reports. And so somehow demand and how we interpret demand as consumption is getting more and more attention. This is an interesting graph, one that as a sociologist, I have sometimes a hard time exactly understanding, but also taken out of the IPCC report. Essentially, what they're saying is not every domain, and for me, I would say not every domain of consumption is equal when it comes to the kind of changes that need to be brought about. And now for, I guess, the first time in these IPCC reports, we're seeing not only a call for infrastructure change, which might be very relevant for human buildings or mobility, for example, if you think of changing, a building's thermal envelope or introducing more bike lanes or what have you. But now there are also sociocultural factors that these scientists are claiming are necessary, and these sociocultural factors are more relevant for nutrition, for example, than they are for buildings. And so this is also sort of sending us signals that a focus on consumption is becoming more relevant. Another angle, perhaps, to think about consumption is to return to the famous IPAT formula from the 1970s, where environmental impact was seen as a factor of population growth and or affluence and or more efficient or less efficient technologies. And we are seeing now a lot of literature emerging and interest in this question of affluence, which does take us again back to the question of consumption. And particularly now in Switzerland, I don't know how it is for you where you're based in Europe, but sufficiency is becoming a word that 2 years ago was really not even spoken in the policy arena. Sobriété in French is almost a bad word. It is the same word that's used for recovering alcoholics. And now suddenly with the war in Ukraine, the particularly warm summer, which has led to a reduction in hydropower in Switzerland, sufficiency is part of a public policy agenda in relation to reducing energy usage. And the question of affluence is starting to getting pick up here in the media as well. So all of this is to sort of set the stage as to why we think, as authors of the Consumption Corridors book, that consumption is really something that merits to be grappled with from a research and policy angle. But of course, we understand consumption and energy demand in a different way, maybe in a more, maybe we're able to problematize a little more what is meant by consumption dynamics, what is meant by sociocultural factors. And here I'm just giving you a few points or high notes from the demand center's work on energy usage, and the idea of energy demand is socially constructed. And so paying attention, I guess, of course, to not only, the individual dynamics of consumption, but the institutional factors that shape consumption, infrastructures, other forms of material arrangements, temporal factors, etc. And so the consumption corridors framework is really intended to not have a form of methodological individualism, but to really think about consumption in its broadest sense, and how systems of provision or institutional arrangements or material arrangements influence how and in what way people consume. I like to show this slide to say that with all that, with all that said and done, with all that background that I'm trying to give you to introduce the consumption corridors concept, I myself have always focused on domains of consumption that are the most significant in environmental terms. So I've always oriented my research towards food and related waste, or energy usage in buildings. I've worked much less on mobility, but there are other scholars in the sociology of consumption or sustainable consumption, of course, that work on mobility, or now fashion is increasingly a hot topic. And what I find very compelling about this consumption corridors approach is that it obliges us to take a slightly different starting point. We are probably most all convinced that there are environmental issues tied up with consumption practices and patterns in societies around the world. And yet starting from this point, in a way, is starting from the problem, right? And it's a valid approach. But increasingly what appeals to me about the consumption corridors approach is that you could also take another starting point, which is to ask the question, what does it mean to live well? What is the sustainable well-being that we want to achieve? And then what resources are necessary to get there? And to me, this has brought into my own research a very different posture. And I'm finding that it is also a way to build bridges with other scholars, even within my faculty of social sciences, who may be working on health or workplace dynamics, et cetera, but also in speaking to the citizen collectives that I work with, or mayor's offices that I might engage with. This idea of well-being really is something that speaks, I think, to more people. And then for sustainable consumption scholars, what I find interesting conceptually is that somehow the aim that you want to achieve, so achieving well-being, here in most of the consumption corridors work, it is framed around human needs satisfaction. And we can discuss in the Q&A whether that is too human focused and whether we need a more post-humanist approach. But essentially, to feel safe, to be part of a community, to live in a pleasant environment, to feel free, etc. These are all human needs that we interpret as being fundamental to human well-being that you can satisfy in very different ways. And it is then that difference and distinction between needs and satisfiers that becomes a central question for sustainability in terms of deciding what satisfiers need to be in place for the most people to be able to satisfy their needs. So all of that, I hope, provides the background of my own pathway towards arriving at this concept of consumption corridors, which I'll now introduce. So essentially, consumption corridors are about living the good life. And on our team, we have political scientists, we have a philosopher, etc. And no doubt, consumption corridors, or it is already going on to live in other spaces, and other people will pick it up and bring their own reflections. But it is based on this idea that a maxima level of consumption is necessary And that going beyond that maxima means that that as a society, we are imperiling the ability of others to live a good life, whilst minima consumption is the idea of a basis of the good life for all. And it's, I think, easier said than done, because as a society, we are not necessarily very comfortable with limits or comfortable with thinking of these forms of spaces between, or essentially inequalities. So minima consumption is something we're more comfortable with. We're comfortable saying everybody needs minimum access to energy, for example, but we're much less comfortable thinking about what that upper limit or maximum might be. So as we were coming up with this concept of maxima and minima, what was essential to us in this process was linking the idea of corridors to human needs. That human needs satisfaction is the ultimate aim. And it is based on human needs satisfaction that we then determine the maxima and minima that might be necessary. So it also assumes that in satisfying human needs, we draw from certain ecological and social resources. And we also recognize that these resources are not distributed equally nor equitably. And there is this forward-thinking posture in consumption corridors that whatever we are doing today, and I think it returns to that, very, Brundtland definition of sustainable development, that somehow consumption corridors should be allowing future generations to also achieve well-being. So when you bring forward well-being, you are stepping on the shoulders of giants. Well-being has been theorized in many different ways. And this is one way in the book that we propose to distinguish between the different currents. So the distinction between hedonistic approaches and eudaimonic approaches go all the way back to Aristotle. And to the left, hedonistic approaches are typically what you might find in global happiness, the Global Happiness Report, or life satisfaction surveys, etc. And the argument for using a eudaimonic approach in the Consumption Corridors book, or at least the argument that I'm most comfortable with proposing, not being a philosopher myself, is that somehow human needs are something that a society can organize for. So you could organize a society to provide all the services that we might imagine a sustainable society could provide, whether it's, access to healthcare, education, public transport, et cetera, But you cannot guarantee, nonetheless, that people in that context will be happy or will be satisfied with their lives. But you can guarantee that human needs will be satisfied. So this is why Consumption Corridors is more oriented towards the needs approach. And in some instances, the needs approach has also been combined with the capabilities approach. Martha Nussbaum, I believe, approaches it that way. But we were very much building on Ian Goff's work, so Doyle and Goff, for the idea of needs, and the work of Antonietta Di Giulio and Enrico De Fila, who are two philosophers here in Switzerland who have also been developing human needs approaches. But there are many approaches to well-being, and to be honest, although I myself have worked very much with the human needs approach, as I've said, I'm now exploring or trying to think of a more post-humanist approach to well-being, and also how to integrate both subjective and objective well-being, because I think there is some importance that we also need to give to having fun, like Rick Wilkes said in his last article on taking fun seriously for sustainable consumption. We tried in the book to make some very simple graphics that are intended to speak for themselves. They build on the literature. So here we were trying to illustrate the fact that it is not by acquiring more stuff or endless material goods do not lead necessarily, don't correlate to more happiness or more well-being. And so this was another argument for why consumption corridors are necessary. To a certain extent, you do need to consume, but then beyond a certain point, consumption limits may not deteriorate your ability or our ability to live a good life. This chart I explained earlier, and I really find it a very useful way to think about sustainability. So I know that a lot of anthropologists and sociologists would raise eyebrows at this idea that needs are universal, fixed, objective, unsubstitutable, etc. So to the right there, you have needs that can come from any number of lists, the Doyle and Goff approach, Ryan and Decci, etc. Participating in society, belonging, having a sense of freedom, autonomy, etc. If we agree that those are objective and can be measured and are the same across different contexts, the ways of meeting those needs vary in different contexts. And this draws directly from Manfred Max Neef's approach to human needs, where he distinguishes satisfiers from needs. And essentially, then you can ask the question, what resources, what infrastructures, what institutions are necessary towards need satisfaction? And therefore, it contextualizes satisfiers as something that is very much context dependent, that is social, that is political, etc. These are illustrations I use to show this essential distinction. I don't know if I'm overdoing the point, but to help illustrate, you could say that riding a bike in Copenhagen or in Geneva allows for the meeting of several needs, such as freedom, subsistence, participation in society, etc. But in another context, like Los Angeles, those same needs would be met by driving a car. I'm exaggerating a little bit, of course, here with the contrast and the images. But so the main idea is that need satisfaction does depend on institutional, structural, normative, material ways of satisfying needs that would vary very much depending on context, situation, time, etc. What is useful about the needs-based approach I have found in operationalizing consumption corridors is that it does allow for some comparison across contexts. So, for example, I did a study in Southeast Asia in several cities. I'll come to that in a moment. And there we used a needs-based approach, and we were able to say something about need satisfaction across different contexts. I think that's one of the reasons why having a list is useful. But another thing we very much brought into consumption corridors, at least conceptually, and we believe strongly it should be part of the operationalization of such a concept, is this idea of societal dialogue. And I myself work with participatory methods. I realize that they are not perfect, that power imbalances are almost a given, that there are many, hurdles to overcome to do it right. But somehow it's never perfect, but always useful. And so we talk in the book about the need to have a societal dialogue around the relevance and legitimacy of limits, of societal limits. We talk also about how needs could be discussed before being operationalized. So this is something I've done recently for a project in Switzerland where we tried to encourage dialogue with citizens around the energy transition. That's where this cartoon comes from, an energy transition and how it may or may not satisfy human needs in the future. And we simply asked the participants to choose what list of human needs they wanted to work with. So I think there is the possibility to be a little bit open and not impose a list on needs on people. But also think about processes in general that are inclusive, transparent, and I know it's easier said than done, but it really, this process of not just imposing corridors, but having corridors somehow emerge from discussions and debates and participatory methods was important to us in writing the book. So I used consumption corridors in a project in Southeast Asia where I was fortunate to partner with colleagues in Manila, Shanghai, Chennai, and Singapore. And the subtitle of the project for me was how to overcome this the hegemony of shopping malls as the only form of leisure in these cities where parks are very much encroached upon by commercial interests. And so we tried to understand in what way parks, which you might call, open spaces or publicly accessible spaces, green spaces, how they were meeting needs for diverse groups across those cities. And so with Manisha Antaraman and Antonietta Di Giulio, we worked on this concept of parks as a type of corridor in relation to space. So what is the minima access to green spaces that people might need, and what potentially is the maxima, as well as urban spaces also need to be used for other forms of satisfiers. What we found was that parks do satisfy human needs in ways that shopping malls do not. And we hope that we've contributed to the literature on green spaces that goes beyond thinking of mental health or physical health or by the biodiversity value of these spaces, or even in relation to adaptation, the microclimates that these spaces provide, to really consider in what way green public spaces meet human needs. And we're able to do this comparatively across the four cities. And so I can give you more information on that if you're interested in the discussion. Another corridor that is being explored is in relation to housing. So I believe there was a European project that had also focused on this question of upper and lower limits to space. And here in the canton of Geneva, for all public buildings, there are limits on maxima, minima floor space per inhabitant. So it's a debate that is still unfolding, and it is happening in a context like Geneva, where access to space is really quite expensive. But so this is one example, perhaps, of how a corridor might be thought of. I think ultimately the idea of corridors is about reorganizing consumption and thinking about how consumption patterns and practices might require certain institutional, structural, and material changes, but always keeping in mind this idea of meeting needs. And in energy studies, we have, and even in the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, there's always been, I think, a focus on efficiency and renewable energies. But now this small footnote on sufficiency that made it in to the last report opens, I think, also a field of research possibilities around the idea of linking sufficiency to well-being. And so in that definition, which Yamina Sahib puts forward in the IPCC report, sufficiency is about meeting needs. And to that, we would add, in that sense, then, how do we reorganize consumption to meet needs for the most people possible? And for that, some kind of consumption maxima and minima could be useful. And it could be a beautiful thing, as we've tried to illustrate with this core green corridor that you see here. At the end of the day, it still remains very much conceptual. I'm really looking forward to your feedback on the concept, and whether consumption corridors are organized by resource or by sector, that would remain to be seen. And one thing we hint at in an article that we wrote with the co-authors to introduce a special issue on consumption corridors is that how to place those maxima and minima is a political issue, because the lower minima, the greater the possibility of inequalities. So if you lower the amount of living space or access to energy that might be available to people at a minima, then the maxima might be placed much higher. So that is one thought that we further developed after writing the book. Another point that we make in the book, and we're going to be debating this at the SCORI conference. I don't know if any of you are going, but a special session has been organized around breaking myths. And in that session, there will be some consumption corridors. There will be a talk around consumption corridors. And so essentially, these myths are holding us back, is what we propose in the book. This idea that freedom comes without responsibility, that technological innovation will always save the day, along with market solutions, or the myth of consumer sovereignty and individual responsibility. And maybe you have other myths to throw in there, but somehow we do hope that consumption corridors, as a normative proposition, as something that contributes to discourses around the good life, has the potential also to overcome some of these myths, to put freedom as a central proposition, so long as needs are being met, to move up to collective level ideas of well-being and responsibility, to see technological innovation or market solutions as satisfiers that are separate from the needs that we want to meet, etc. So here is the cover of the book, and I hope I've given you a feel for the content. As I was saying, we hope it's contributing to a new imaginary, a real utopia, and to really be thinking about how to organize society differently. So thanks so much for that, for giving me this opportunity to talk, and I'll now close the slides, and I guess we will open for the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Marlyne. We can open the discussion if there are comments. I know. Meanwhile, I was thinking of suggesting you this article. Marlyne also contributed that she talked about during her presentation, From Planetary to Social Boundaries, an argument for collectively defined self-limitation. I see that this was published and written after the consumption corridors, and I think that it completes very well what she talked tonight to us. Don't know if there are reaction.
Well, I'm happy to start. Just in case, if anyone has a question before, just please go. But otherwise, I'm happy to start with mine. I can see any raised hands so far, so I'm just going to ask my question. Thank you so much, Marlyne, for accepting our invitation, and I think the idea of consumption corridor is really convincing, and also this focus on well-being. What does it mean to live a good life? I think it's the question probably that I found really convincing. And my question is, so you mentioned at the beginning the donuts economics framework. And I wanted to ask, what are maybe you mentioned already like some limitations of that framework and how consumption corridor is overcoming those. But I was wondering if you could expand that a little bit, especially because next month we're going to have a speaker from the Donut Economics Action Lab. So they're also going to present that initiative. So I think it's interesting to understand how these two frameworks compare with each other and how maybe they can be complementary. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Yes, I am a donut economics fan. I teach donut economics to my students. I'm part of a group at Geneva that is working to bring the donut as a new indicator for the canton of Geneva in terms of thinking about sustainable well-being. I think consumption corridors can fit in the donut. Essentially, if we look at social foundations, maxima and minima limits to energy could be a useful addition. So that's one way to answer it, which is to say potentially they're complementary. But another way to answer it is that if I talk to my colleagues who work on the sociology of health, for example, attaining a certain level of health services is at a minima is something most everyone will agree to. And we've also just been through this pandemic, etc. But to them, the question of, well, then where do we place the maxima? It's another question, and it's it can relate to resources that are available, like the energy needed to support intensive care units and things like that. It can relate to the space that is available in a given context. But I find corridors, or this idea of upper and lower limits, really does introduce another dynamic that maybe the donut doesn't have, because for the donut, the upper trespassing of limits is always related to planetary boundaries. And like I said, great model, really necessary for me as a new paradigm, a new model to be used at the city level, state level, etc. But getting into the nitty gritty of, okay, how do we organize the consumption of healthcare services, or how do we organize the consumption of energy? There, I feel maxima and minima in relation to space, time, but also biophysical resources might be also useful and necessary. And I think it also gives a specific focus to consumption dynamics, or at least that's the idea.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you.
Yes, sorry, Asa.
Yes.
I didn't saw you. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Marlyne.
Hi.
Hi. Great to see you, and thank
Great
you
to
for a
see
really
you.
nice talk. I have a question. You talked a bit about the debate in Switzerland, or the discussion on energy and sufficiency, and how sufficiency has grown as a concept these late past years. I was wondering, do you see when it comes to consumption corridors and also the energy crisis right now, do you find consumption corridors and sufficiency as do you find the concepts are helping in any way in trying to bring those issues to the table when it comes to energy policy and so on, and in what ways? Because I find it in Sweden, at least, it can be easier to talk about sufficiency and limits when it comes to energy than when it comes to material consumption or other types of consumption. So it would be interesting to hear your reflections on that.
Yes. So the war and the extremely hot summer has led to federal guidelines and cantonal guidelines in Switzerland around energy usage this winter that went from that focused mainly on the large consumers. So placing certain limits in terms of things like not being able to have hot water in the universities, or not being able to have Christmas lights up in the city center and things like this. I think it's both hopeful and dangerous, in the sense that for many people the crisis is only related to the war and our lack of gas provisioning from Russia, and the media has not given sufficient attention at all to the lack of hydropower due to an extremely warm summer due to climate change. And so there is sort of this idea that we are once again in a moment of rupture, but that there will be a back to normal. And even when you talk to policymakers today about sufficiency, I have a research project that we're doing on sufficiency this winter, and we're doing it in parallel with some colleagues from Mistra, with Melanie Jaeger in Berlin, with Kirsten Graham Hansen Copenhagen, but when I talk to city officials here about sufficiency, they say, no, Marlyne, don't mix the two together. We are doing, energy savings around the energy crisis right now, and we don't want people to think that we're using this as a pretext to push sufficiency measures on people. So I thought that was quite interesting. So I think it's too early to say whether it's going to help or not, but it has brought sufficiency onto the table. It used to be a bad word, and now at least it's it's something that you read about in the media, etc. And there is also big debates around what is needed or not, what is necessary or not, and how do Christmas lights contribute nonetheless to a sense of belonging to a community or not. So yeah, I think we're researching it now, and I think there will be some interesting things to say about this period. Thanks.
Thank you.
I see Magnus on the list. Sorry, I was mute.
Thank you. I think it's an interesting concept and good presentation. I wonder if you could say something, how do we approach the richest segment of the population? If you have any clever ideas about that, both how to grapple with these, this segment, let's say 10% richest or 1%, or because that's the biggest problem, I guess.
Yeah.
And also to study them if you have ideas, but not, of course, the richest as a problem in itself, particularly in accepting limits on regulating their consumption, but also study them and their overconsumption. Or
yes, yeah, thank you for that. I wrote a chapter some time ago called it was about social lock-in, where I did research on the affluent here in Geneva, and I found that they are locked into certain social expectations around what is the good life. And so I want to answer the question a bit indirectly by saying that I engage quite a bit with social practice theory, and I see practices as satisfiers. So I use those two somewhat interchangeably. And so you could look at the practices of the rich and try and understand what elements of practices need to change for them to be able to satisfy their same needs, but with less energy and material intensity. And one idea that comes to mind around that study I did on social lock-in some time ago is that there really is this idea of escalating social expectations and having to keep up constantly and maintain, and all the energy and time that goes into that. And sometimes you are able to have conversations. I have done research with the leads here in Geneva where they do sort of fantasize about some form of sufficiency. Now, whether that sufficiency really matches our understanding of what a reduced impact would be, or whether it's still a very high consumer form of minimalism that we might see in a Netflix TV series remains to be questioned. But maybe working on those more normative dimensions of their everyday lives and how they're organized, it could be one way to tackle it. We have a project right now where the subtext is the hard to rich, and it's about, it's called Dialogues. It's a European project. It's about engaging citizens in thinking about climate action plans, and we're doing it in the wealthiest communities in Geneva. So we wanted to reach the hard to reach. But unfortunately, we're finding that the people who are coming and engaging in the process are those who are already convinced, at least convinced by the idea of living a more sustainable life. Whether or not they have put it into practice completely or not remains to be a question. So I don't have any easy answer, but I'd love to think about this further with you or with others. We should, thanks for that.
Michele and Alice, I see.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Marlyne. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. I have two questions. So the first is about this minimum and maximum threshold, let's say. But I was wondering whether the fact that there exists this this space doesn't or create at least a risk of any way reproducing some inequalities. I mean, isn't there the possibility that there are people who are structurally put at the minimum level and people who are structurally put at the maximum level? And okay, this is more sustainable, maybe more equitable than today, but still, how do you deal with that difference or differential? First question. The second question is about, and you didn't tackle it very much in the presentation, but it was at least mentioned in the book, and this is something that really interests me about the debate about needs, like around, let's say, founding sustainability around needs, which is the role that desire, that the issue of desire can have within this this context. Because normally when we talk about needs, desire is always constructed as the other and the bad other, like the one that drives consumption and etc. But like from my own point of view, perspective, and background, let's say sociological, philosophical, socio-psychological background, desire can also be something very different from that. Can be a drive and to revolution, to to change things, and also something that structurally somehow eschews the limits of enjoyment that is created by society. I think I saw Deleuze in your library back there. I'm not sure, but it was just a moment earlier. And coming from that kind of background, I wonder whether it would be possible to also integrate or think in a bit more complex way about that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. It sounds like you should have joined us in this enterprise of authoring the book. You would have no doubt contributed very nicely to that. I'll start with the last point. Honestly, it is, I think in the book, at least, the idea was to find a way to differentiate needs, which are universal, satiable, unsubstitutable, etc., from other things that, in Ian Goff's language, are infinite, never-ending. I'm thinking of Adorno's critiques of the culture industry, that's somehow creating desires that are never satiated, and on and on. And so Ian's idea is that somehow focusing on needs will always be less material and energy resource intensive than focusing on desires, because they have this unlimited nature, etc. But I think we're using the term desire very loosely to englobe something that is infinite. I think that is our only point, is that there's something infinite in desires that makes it difficult to say they have been satisfied. And that's why needs is maybe a better approach. I don't think that's a perfect answer, and I'd love to think further about the role of desire, as you said, as a driver for emotions in generally, like how emotions can bring people through participation to engage in consumption corridors is something we need to tackle. I had a bit of an aha moment doing participatory research myself and teaching a class on critical participatory action research. I had this aha moment that is so basic, but I'm going to share it with you. And it's that I suddenly realized that actually participation is a human need, and we're talking about participation as the aim, that we want people to feel they can participate in society. At the same time, corridors is suggesting that should be a part of the process. And I think emotions need to come in there, if I understood your point. And then your point is also excellent about inequalities. They will always exist. I want to say there's no consumption corridors doesn't suggest that inequalities are erased. There will always be a minima and a maxima and a range of consumption patterns within that minima and maxima. The idea, and it's easier said than done, it is still conceptual, is that somehow the corridor is more equal than what we have now, because in no way does living in the corridor prohibit others around the world today or in the future from living the good life. But you should have heard some of our late night conversations over a glass of wine while we were finishing the book, where I would say, but everyone in Europe is living above the corridor. You know, I mean, of course, if you start looking at consumption corridors globally, there are huge issues. So then how do you bring a more regional approach? And I guess starting the conversation is what we're proposing. At least to start the conversation. It's not going to be perfect. We don't know if it should be done by country, by city, by sector. It'll never be a perfect corridor compared to how people might be living, you know, in other parts of the world. But at least it's a starting point. And justice is a central part of it, because ultimately there is this idea of maxima and minima only being necessary because we don't want to plan for consumption in such a way that others will be prohibited from meeting needs. But I'd love to continue discussing with you on desires. We should keep in touch on that.
Sorry, thank you. And I would just say that I need to rush because I need to pick up my baby from the kindergarten, but it was
okay. Thank you for being here. Thanks a lot.
It's an important need, in effect.
Yes.
Wooking, I don't know if I mispronounced, but
yeah, can you hear me clearly?
perfectly.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. My name is Wookjun Lee. I'm from South Korea. Yeah, nice to meet you. So I have two questions. The first question is that in long terms, that is the sustainable, is the consumption corridor is you mentioned at the time as the sustainable development goals, right? So in which aspects there are 17 goals. So in which aspect is connect as the do you think as the connect as the consumption corridor is the first question. And then the second question is that you mentioned kind of an energy, right? So in fact, due to the these days there is a Ukraine war, so that's why the energy sustainability is very serious. And in fact, as I mentioned, I'm from South Korea. So in fact, in Korea is all between China, Russia, Japan, and United States, because of the kind of like a democracy, and then so the other like things or conflict each other. So that's why the energy consumption is a very serious moment. So do you think that in this aspect the consumption corridor is go for the energy crisis to solution is one of the good solutions, do you think? I think it's very difficult question to ask, but and also I don't know you understand my question.
Yes,
anyway,
I did.
Thanks a lot.
I did. Yeah, thank you. I'll try
Yeah.
to respond. So for the first question on the link to STGs, I can answer it in two ways. If you want to build a research proposal and get funding for consumption corridors, then do feel free to link consumption corridors to every single one of the SDGs. I'm sure you will find a way to do that. And more specifically, maybe SDG 12, is it right? On sustainable consumption production. What I was trying to say in the presentation is that we can be critical of these SDGs as well. They are rather linear, they're not interrelated. And to me, the donut model takes SDGs a step further in that they place things like access to energy in relation to climate change and biodiversity loss. So I don't know if it answers your question perfectly, but I will move to the second one, which as Osha was saying, and I took note of this. I think it's a really good point. We should have some kind of a consumption corridors debate or forum now around the energy crisis. I think that would be very relevant and interesting. I'd love to be a part of that. I will suggest it to my co-authors, because indeed it really does, at least the media discourses that we're seeing in Switzerland really do bring in the question of whose needs are being satisfied, what reductions should be put in place, in what sectors, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, thanks for that. I will keep thinking about it.
Yeah. Why I said this because in fact, Korea has no natural resources, so that's why we import all the things. So that's why, because as the Middle East, they has the like a crude oil, like oil, gas is a lot, but in Korea we import all from the Middle East, and then so that's why the human resource is the only answer right now to maintain our to South Korea as a situation, but just worry that if the energy crisis is serious, but if there's a political conflict happens, then Korea will be like a floating island, I thought. So that's why. But in terms of the sustainable consumption corridor is one of the solution. That's what I thought. So that's why I asked. Yeah. Anyway. Oh, thanks very much.
It could be. It could be. I mean, you have to see how to apply it in your context. But yeah.
I see Gail.
Thank you. Hi, Marlyne. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really appreciate the effort that you put into operationalizing what sustainable consumption might be. And I understand it's a very difficult exercise. My questions kind of echo those that Alice just asked. I have like one real question around also like inequality and what you said about avoiding the trap of universalization and how you deal with that tension. And by that, I mean, like, so when you're trying, the examples that you gave when talking about trying to avoid universalization effect was to show how we could adapt that idea of the corridors to different contexts. But that also produces different levels of limit, different thresholds, or different types of needs. So how do you reconcile that with the inequality effect that might produce, and the fact that in a certain context, you talked about LA, for instance, where people still need the car to be mobile and access this freedom need, and other contexts where you have more public transportation, so the needs are different. But if you bring that at perhaps other levels, other types of consumption, you can create really like very unequal situations and models. So that was my first question. And another one that I have is that with this idea of limits, aren't you worried that there might be some sort of like authoritarian feel to it, and the idea of imposing a certain way of living could be problematic for accepting this idea, and whether or not talking in terms of target perhaps would be more easily acceptable by the wider public.
Thank you. Excellent questions, Gail. So for the first one, I think the main point that we're trying to make is that the satisfiers are always must always be contextualized. They are always dependent on social, political settings, infrastructures, institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And so currently in Los Angeles, you cannot satisfy human needs with a bike, as to use this extreme example. You do need a car to satisfy many needs, but it's not the need that we're questioning here. The need does remain universal, fixed, etc. The need for freedom, the need for sustenance, the need for protection in society. It really brings attention to the fact that how we organize consumption is what merits to be discussed and unpacked and But then the inequality angle is to say, and maybe here I can refer to Max Neef's different categorizations of satisfiers. He says there are single satisfiers that satisfy a single need, but then he'll say that there are certain satisfiers that destroy needs, that inhibit the possibility of people to satisfy their needs. And right now I'm working on an adaptation proposal. And to use the example of the car again, an air-conditioned car in a very hot summer in Geneva does allow an individual to satisfy a whole bunch of needs, but it is directly contributing to the urban heat island effect, 1 to 2 degrees more in cities during the summer, and therefore it's hindering the ability of other people to meet needs. So I think at the end of the day, it's about seeing how can we implement what Max Neef calls synergic satisfiers, which are satisfiers which meet the most needs for the most people possible. We did the same thing in the parks that I mentioned in South and Southeast Asia. We found that everyone's needs were being met, but some needs were being met more than others. The middle classes were able to use parks in ways that lower classes in Chennai, for example, who want to use fountains for bathing or benches for sleeping, etc., were not able to satisfy their needs in the same way. So there is always, a question of inequality and justice that you can give to your reading of how consumption corridors are playing out. So like I said, it doesn't erase the question of inequalities. It just tries to be more equal, or think about synergic satisfiers that satisfy well-being for the most people possible. Around this authoritarian question, of course, it's a central issue because we try and put so much emphasis on the need for participation, deliberation. But again, easier said than done. Maybe one way to respond to that is Antonietta Di Giulio, one of my co-authors, and Enrico De Fila, they did test the idea of human needs in a survey among the Swiss population. So they have a list of human needs, and they submitted this needs to a representative survey where they asked the question, should society organize to ensure that human needs are satisfied? And there the response was yes. So there is sort of consensus on the idea that societies should be organizing to satisfy needs for the most people possible. Now, again, how to operationalize it is really another question. There's some interesting new forms of debate that are emerging here in Switzerland. Citizen assemblies are emerging, youth parliaments are emerging, and we know that these instances either lead to political decision-making or they don't. We know they can also be instrumentalized and all of this, but somehow I do feel that there are new spaces for these kinds of debates, at least. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but thank you.
Natalia?
Hi, I think, yeah, the last part of your answer partly answered also to my question, but I'm making the question in any way. Yeah, my question was about the role of collective action, and I wonder if we are ready to self-impose some limits to our consumption, because, for example, or if we need a superior authority imposing these limits. For example, I'm thinking about the energy issues, and we are witnessing the diffusion of community energy. But the literature on community energy is quite critical, because it's showing that by transforming the citizen in an economic actor, what is actually being done with this is not necessarily going in a direction of more democracy or more equality, but there is cooptation, etc. So I'm wondering.
Yes, good question. I have a colleague here working on energy communities, and she's convinced me that there's not much community going on in these energy communities. So it sounds like it's similar.
Yes.
In your context. I think, well, I'm going to answer the question indirectly. I think somehow consumption corridors allows us to avoid an over-individualization of limits. So, you know, there are efforts done on a voluntary individual basis to, you know, to give yourself a carbon cap, for example, or to limit the amount of kilometers you travel in a given year. You know, we know that all of these things are emerging. I think what consumption corridors does, hopefully, is say, if we are to take needs satisfaction seriously as something that can be planned for and protected in society, and if we agree that satisfiers are the ways in which we organize consumption, for me through practices, for others through, you know, other concepts, then we take seriously the fact that changes to consumption require collective forms of change, some that are very visible, like infrastructure changes, as echoed in the IPCC report. You know, we need investments in in energy efficient buildings, et cetera, but also maybe the less tangible and nonetheless rigid norms and expectations and conventions around what is the good life. So I know because I do a lot of research on the ground, that what I'm saying remains very conceptual, but ultimately I am attracted to this idea to think of collective forms of need satisfaction that can be organized, that can be planned for, whether at the level of a citizens collective or at the level of a city or and a state. And I think it goes back to this question of, you know, not an authoritarian approach, but an approach that nonetheless somehow is authoritarian about needs, about the need to ensure well-being for the greatest amount of people possible. And that brings us back to the donut, because I think the donut does help give a new goal, a new aim, a new engine, a new aim to reach for. Yeah.
If I can jump in, I also have a question that is actually related to what you are discussing now. I mean, I think that the book, just to make to introduce with a general comment, I mean, I think that the book is really precious, and I urge everybody in this webinar to read, because it does really a good summary of all the theory about and thoughts about a good life, but also this interesting discussion about needs versus desires and satisfiers. I think that it is really interesting. One part, you know, is exactly when you are reading a book and you find yourself, and it's really clarify some of your doubts. And I really appreciated the part about what processes are needed, because I clearly agree with you that we need participatory process to activate collective action, and to also to stimulate the people to think what are the problems, what are the needs, and how do we feel about the limits. So I really found myself, and also part of the research we are trying to do here in our small group at the University of Trento. But then since we are actually adopting the position that you have, because actually you are an engaged social scientist, so I wanted to ask you, what do you, I mean, through your through your own research, what are the main obstacles that you find when you're approaching and trying to work with this concept of consumption corridors? I mean, how do the people react?
Thank you, Francesca. There are so many, I think, obstacles, and some of them are those myths that we presented, that you know individual freedom is the way to go, or we don't need to think of corridors because there will be technical solutions, or the market will save us, that kind of stuff. But maybe going a little bit beyond that, I do think it is the combination of limits that disturbs people. Like I said before, somehow a lower limit is something people agree to. We need a minimal access to energy, water, etc. So I think it's this idea of upper limits that is more problematic. And in the paper, that we wrote that you mentioned on societal boundaries, I went back to read some of Andre Gortz's work. I don't know if you're so, and he has not aged, one bit from his writings in the 1970s, I guess, and 80s. And he talks about this idea of autonomously coming up with self-limits. And he really talks about this happening at a societal level. And it goes to the discussion we were just having around deliberation and what process and all that. And I think that some kind of societal debate around self-limitation, not individual self-limitation, but what do we need as a society to live a good life? And can that still be achieved with less, which is this whole sufficiency proposal, I find is interesting. Now, the only danger with that, because I have my colleague Antonietta Di Giulio, coming into one ear. I mean, she will say, sure, you can do better with less, right? Which is the proposal, which is the hopeful proposal. Yes, you can still achieve well-being by consuming less. I think Jackson had a wonderful paper on this called The Double Dividend in Consumption. Yes, you should be able to achieve well-being and consume less, but ultimately, as Antonietta likes to remind me, you can also achieve well-being by consuming a whole lot more. And it's this, it does come down to this question of justice, I feel, and whether or not as a society we're willing to move beyond individual well-being, to think of collective well-being over generations. And then I just want to throw in another curveball. I've been really inspired lately by reading Donna Haraway's work, and I myself, I'm even now trying to think of another way of thinking about well-being that is not only human-centered, because at the end of the day, this approach assumes that natural resources are part of the satisfiers that we're better organizing, right? So we're still in this like efficiency posture where we're trying to minimize stocks and flows. And then if not, human well-being should not lead to overpassing planetary boundaries and other effects, side effect of what we as humans do. And I'm increasingly not satisfied with this approach either. And I'd like to think of other ways of considering more than human well-being. And one approach that I'm starting to untangle now is this idea of, comes back to deliberation actually, of agreeing in any given setting of what of whose needs we are discussing, and agreeing how we come about with proposals for meeting them. So that was a long-winded question, but if any of you are interested in this post-humanist approach to well-being, I'm trying to gather a small group of people together to have a discussion. I think it's May 4th. I have to just write me an email and I'll put you in the loop if you're interested. Just to make things a bit more complicated, right? Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you to you. Any other question or comment?
No, can I just come in back again, just shortly on this very last point? So I think it's really interesting shifting from a view of the natural world as a thing, as a material resource, and then moving away from this and thinking at the natural world as a living being. So that's a completely different ontological perspective. It's not a thing and a resource that we need to allocate in the most efficient way, but is a living being, the whole ecosystems and living it, that is what it is, like just living beings. So just shifting the mindset around what it is, the natural environment, and what is our role within it. I think it's really interesting.
We're not on the planet, we're in the planet. And Francesca, just to your point again about what I see as some major hurdles. The hurdle is the opportunity, but increasingly I've really been like out there with the message that yes, there's something that has to change in terms of infrastructures, yes, technology, why not? But I've been bringing in this idea that, but there are also collective conventions that we need to change. I think as sociologists, this is a message that we need to be bringing forward and voicing a bit more. And it really has to do with like this norm. What is the current normative understanding of what is right or wrong, and how do we unpack that, and how do we challenge that without reinforcing it? You know, all of those dynamics I think are interesting. Like I was saying before, it's not just the material things that have a stronghold on how practices play out. It is these really unspoken, tacit understandings of what is comfortable, what is, you know, what is the good life. And that's, I think we need to get in there and start unpacking. And maybe needs is one way of unpacking it. Yes, you want your car, you want your TV, etc. But does it lead to the satisfaction of these 5 needs? And if it doesn't, then maybe we can think of organizing consumption another way. Another research project. About 10 research projects have come out of this discussion. And I've taken plenty of notes to share with my co-authors. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you to you. And I think that we can close the discussion if there is no other question. Thank you very much, Marlyne. It was a very interesting talk and discussion. And Marlyne is also, as I said before, editing this new journal, Consumption and Society. So have a look at that and keep in touch.
Yes, please do consider submitting to Consumption and Society. Thanks for flagging that. And especially, we're really interested in early career scholars and voices that are not necessarily from Europe and North America. So, well, all of you are welcome, but that is also part of our mission to try and internationalize a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Bye,
Ciao.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.